I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts during the 90s. It was a great time and place to be a kid. Our main street was chock full of kid-friendly activities. There was an enormous outside go-kart track with a huge arcade full of the best games from the 80s and 90s. I remember spending hours playing the alligator version of Whack-A-Mole. Then, just down the street, there was Toontown. It wasn't anything special, just a typical 90s music store. But they had a cute little dog with a bandana who was in all their TV commercials. Though I've long forgotten the little guy's name. He was really cute. Whenever I'd go in to buy a new cassette tape, he'd be there to greet me at the door. Out of all the places I went to as a kid, Funland was by far the greatest. It had its own go-kart track, a small one for little kids and a larger one for bigger kids. It wasn't as big or fancy as the one down the street, but it was still fun. There were batting cages too, lots of them. You had a small arcade mostly filled with pinball machines, Pac-Man, and the always popular Simpsons arcade game. But the best thing about Funland was the mini golf course. It was the only one in the area at the time, and in the eyes of a 10-year-old kid, the place was huge. The iconic spaceship with the Funland logo sat in the center of the park, and you could see it from the street, along with a giant giraffe statue which stared out into the parking lot, smiling down at you as you entered. There were other memorable statues, too, including a pink elephant and a large dollhouse that sat in the back corner. But the greatest part of the entire park was the 18th hole. On the outside, it just looked like an ordinary outhouse. If you got a hole in one, not only did you get a free game, but the outhouse door would swing open and you'd hear the sound of a toilet flushing, along with the hiss of the hydraulics that moved the animatronic inside. It was a funny-looking humanoid dog wearing overalls, with one strap hanging down off his shoulder, as if he just pulled them up. His eyes would blink, his jaw would move, and his arm would rise as he pointed at you, scolding you for disturbing him. "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Get out of here!" he'd yell, in a goofy attempt at a southern accent. Then the door would close, and you and your friends would have a good laugh before you left. Every time I went there, I couldn't wait to see that dog. Like all things from childhood, the fun of Main Street slowly faded away. I think the go-kart track and arcade were the first to go, sitting abandoned for years before it being turned into a daycare center. They still kept the track, having only gutted and rebuilt the arcade to serve their needs, so it just sat there in the back with one or two remaining go-karts frozen in time. And then Toontown went out of business, unable to keep up with bigger music chains like Newberry Comics and FYE. I imagine that cute little dog has to be dead by now. Last to go, of course, was Funland. It was painful to see it start to rot and decay in its last few years of life. The paint on the animal statues faded, the eyes of the giraffe looking sadly out into the emptying parking lot as less and less visitors came to see it. Then the park officially closed. I was heartbroken. By that time, I was in high school, and it had been a long time since I visited the park. I used to drive by on my way to work, watching it slowly deteriorating away. The elephant eventually tipped over onto its side. The chain around its huge stump of a foot that had been keeping it latched to the ground was now visible and exposed. The doors and windows of the dollhouse were broken and shattered, as if they were real abandoned houses. And the outhouse door remained closed, the wood creaking with age. I can only imagine what that poor animatronic dog inside looked like. Eventually, nature reclaimed the once thriving park, and I could no longer see into it. All that remained visible was the head of the giraffe, peeking over the rusted fence. Curiosity got the better of me, so I gathered my two friends, Kevin and Zach, one night, and we decided to break in and check it out. As we walked up to the surrounding gate, I looked up at the giraffe. It was the first time I noticed just how creepy it looked. Its yellow coat of paint had almost completely faded, leaving only its brown spots and huge almond-shaped black eyes. Continuing on, we snuck into the back of the park near the batting cages. Zach brought a pair of garden shears and cut the fence open, just enough for us to squeeze through. As I entered the park for the first time in what must have been over a decade, I looked around in complete awe. Everything was just how I remembered it. The go-karts were still on the tracks. The batting cages still had balls in them, but the arcade was all boarded up. The mini-golf course was covered with trees, was damp with overflow from the nearby swamp. I sighed, saddened by the sight of what was once a happy and magical place from my childhood. The feeling the old abandoned park gave off at night sent a shiver down my spine. I never really noticed how creepy it was until then. We went through the course in order, starting at the first hole. There was nothing special, just the usual challenging mounds of fake grass, now moist with rain. The swamp hadn't reached that far yet. As we continued, we walked past the pink elephant, now a shade of ghostly white. He lay on his side, eyes staring vacantly out into the park, as if he had just expired. I ran my fingers over his massive head before moving on. The dollhouse was the next memorable thing we came across. It looked like a miniature haunted house. I half expected the broken doors and windows to be boarded up, like the arcade was, but you could still see inside. The little pieces of furniture were all toppled over and spilled out on the ground. This is the part of the park where the swamp had touched. The smell wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. The town was covered with swamps, as it was. We couldn't reach the entire back section unless we wanted to wade through the disgusting water. Our only choice was to head straight to the 18th hole. Finally, the part of the park I wanted to see the most. More than anything, I wanted to see that dog again. There was half nostalgia and half an excited sort of fear of what it would look like. Was it even still there? Was it in good condition, preserved by the outhouse? Or was it like everything else in the park, sad and neglected after all this time? I couldn't wait to find out. Did you bring it? I asked Kevin. He nodded and handed me one of his dad's golf balls. I held it in my hand, sighing deeply as I ran my thumb over the grooves. I had stepped up to the outhouse and peered underneath where I knew the hole would be, when there was a sudden flash of light temporarily blinding me. "What the fuck, Zach?" I complained, blinking away the white-yellow spots in my eyes. "I was just trying to help," he replied moodily. "Let's just hurry up and get out of here." "Yeah," added Kevin. "This place gives me the creeps. Until I see him," I snapped. I'm sure I must have sounded crazy. I was talking about the dog as if it were a person. To me, he was more than just some sideshow attraction to be gawked at. He was a part of my childhood. It was like I was about to meet an old friend I hadn't seen in ages. My friends didn't reply. Zach simply kept his flashlight pointed beneath the outhouse, and Kevin sighed in annoyance, tapping his foot impatiently. But now we could all see it. The hole. The white tube in the ground that brought the golf balls back into the little hut at the entrance that once contained all the golf balls and clubs. It was barely visible over the mound created by the fake turf, but it was still there. And I had a clear shot. I placed the ball on the ground and, aiming carefully, rolled it towards the hole. We could hear the ball enter the pipe, the sound of it swirling down into the ground echoing in the silent park. Zach and I stepped back beside Kevin, the light now shining on the outhouse itself. I clenched my fist in anticipation, wishing with all of my heart that it would somehow still work, that the door would open and the dog would still be there. It was a stupid wish. We all jumped to the sudden sound of the once familiar flushing noise, now slightly distorted. Then the doors began to open and the loud hiss of the hydraulics resonated through the night. We stood there breathless and silent. It worked! We actually made it work! After all these years, I'd finally get to see him again. I was so happy that I could feel the sides of my mouth curl into a magnificent smile, as if I were a child opening a present. But the present wasn't what I had been expecting at all. There he stood. My once familiar friend, my reward for getting my hole-in-one, but I could hardly recognize him. The fur that covered his metal frame was matted and wet, and his overalls hung loose around him like it would if someone had lost a great deal of weight. My breath caught in my throat, which was now suddenly dry. I swallowed softly, eyes widening as they traveled up to the dog's face. It was a horrible, hideous sight. The fake fur on half of his head had torn away, exposing the wires and joint mechanisms in his mechanical jaw. I never remembered him having teeth. On the same side, his plastic eye had sprung from its socket and now remained dangling by his torn cheek. And then he blinked. The mechanism on the broken eye shuddered around the exposed wire, releasing small sparks. More sparks flew as his arm shot up with a clang, and the hinge of his jaw creaked as his mouth flopped open. He spoke. "What do you think you're doing here?" The funny southern drawl of his voice was completely gone, replaced by something raspy, angry. Although I could hear the chilling distortion in his voice box, he sounded more human than I'd ever remembered. Kevin ran. He didn't even look back. Zach dropped his phone and suddenly backed away, screaming as he stared into the dog's one good eye, which seemed to turn on him at the disturbance. Then, somehow, the dog moved forward. He wasn't programmed to walk. As far as I knew, the hydraulics attached to his back only sat him up. He wasn't supposed to walk, but by God, I saw that once funny animatronic dog from my childhood step out of that old, withered outhouse towards us. I stood there, frozen in fear, staring at it. Fuck this, I heard Zach utter before he too left me. And now I was alone. With him. I'd spent so many years thinking about this very moment. I spent countless hours thinking about this dog and wanting to see him one last time, but I knew then I should never have stepped foot into this old park. My childhood was dead, as broken as the wires and metal rods that barely held the dog together. He seemed to watch Zach go, his good eye turning with a crackling sound as he watched him disappear into the darkness. And then turned on me. "Get out," he commanded, his arm still pointing, now into the direction of the parking lot, where the headlights of Zach's car just turned on. I didn't move. I could only stare. Was this some kind of sick nightmare? Some bizarre fantasy my brain thought up to get my mind off of? A time I could no longer return to? The thing stepped closer, its disfigured face near inches from my own. The smell of wet dog seemed to invade my nostrils. "Get out of here," it boomed, the voice box short-circuiting as if it had exploded before slowly fading out. It sounded like multiple voices had spoken, all deep and aggressive, almost demonic. This time, I'd listened, and I ran as fast as I could through the park, which was dimly lit by the headlights of the car. My eyes darted around. The once familiar area now seemed foreign and strange. I couldn't tell where I was going. I heard the sound of children laughing, the trumpeting call of an elephant, and the clanging and grinding of metal gears. When I finally reached the fence, I tried sliding through the hole we came through, but I got stuck on something. I looked down to see if my jacket was caught, but it wasn't, and then I looked back. Staring right into my eyes was one plastic eyeball with a painted-on black pupil. My eyes widened, staring back into that black spot as if it were a hole ready to swallow me alive. And then I discovered the reason I was stuck. The hand of the animatronic dog was gripping the back of my shirt. I know that hand was supposed to be stuck in a pointing position. It didn't have any mechanical functions to actually open and close, but then again, the dog wasn't supposed to be walking. "You shouldn't have come back," I heard it whisper, sending a chill up my spine, and then it released me with a shove, and I fell through the opening in the fence. Scrambling to my feet, I ran to Zach's car, not once looking back as he sped off down Main Street. It's been 5 years since that night. I don't talk to Kevin and Zach much anymore, and we've never spoken of the incident, not even on the car ride home. I never drove down that stretch of Main Street either, until today. It was late, and the road I usually take had a detour which led me right to it. What harm would driving by do? I should have known better. I tried not to look. I really did. But I just couldn't help sneaking a peek. I couldn't see much through all the rain, but I noticed the large "For Lease" sign that now hung on the fence. The giraffe was gone. Perhaps it had fallen over and was hidden under the thick brush. With a sigh, I continued on, trying to push the memories of that night out of my mind. My windshield began to fog up from the indecisive New England weather, so I put my defrosters on. And then I noticed something. Instead of clearing from the bottom up like it normally would, my windshield began to clear in patterns. It formed words. I stared at them, hoping with all hope that it was just a fluke or a figment of my imagination, but the message was clear. Don't come back. When the police asked what caused me to crash into the pole just outside of the abandoned park, all I could do was wrap the blanket they gave me tightly around myself as I stared back towards the bushes and trees that concealed the location of the 18th hole. Dog was all I could tell them. It was that dog. Hey there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video, or by listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. I know I haven't had as many updates as I would like to have on the channel lately, and things just kind of get really hard with shit that's happening in my family. But hey, I wanted to say thank you so much for being around, thank you so much for still supporting me and for coming back to listen to new stories. If you guys want to get updates anytime that I do upload, then please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Or if you're listening over a podcast, I think it's still a subscribe button or a follow button or whatever happen. Those happen to be. As always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody out there on patreon.com/Mr. Creepypasta. A very, very big thank you to everybody there, and to especially Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, King Crab, Calcifer420, Veronica Lynn Lopez, Marlon Chavez, Azazel66603, Ethan Leon, Polaris Prospect X, Blake Rattler, Viceroy Scorn, Samara Lynn, Disciple, Sillyman, Brandon Mendoza, Brimstone Pandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna Crow, Lakeda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Dante Kincaid, Simba's Bloody Mojo, Curse Pox Primarch, M, Jettis Pet, Clonable, Jay Kieran, Mike, Himbo Jerry, Crusader Chocobo, Remember the Sun, Estebean, Hour Minute Second Time, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Voice of Sand, Ficomel, Melted Lake, Tully Sue, Croconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Tommy Walters, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Tristan Pelton, Ball Arms the Rat, The Ginger Bros, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kinchin. To all of you guys there, everybody who's down in the description, and everybody who can just give $1 I want to say thank you to you guys. And if you would like to join this list in the description, head over to patreon.com/MrCreepy. And if you would like to join this list in the description, sweet dreams.